All right, sailor. Ready to drift off with a tale or two from the days when living by the sea sounded romantic, right up until the smell hit you? Go ahead. Dim the lights. Maybe you've got the window cracked just enough to hear the rain or the slow pull of the tide somewhere in the distance. If you're listening in bed, stretch your legs and imagine they're hanging over the edge of an old wooden dock. The air smells of salt and smoke, and maybe something vaguely fishy that's better left unidentified. Tonight, we're traveling back several hundred years to a time when coastal living didn't mean a pastel cottage with a nice view, but rather poverty, mildew, and a constant risk of drowning in your own front yard. Yes, my friend, living by the sea in medieval times sucked. Now don't get me wrong, there were perks. The view was technically breathtaking, assuming you ignored the plague ships and the occasional washed-up whale carcass. Fresh seafood was plentiful, but so were food-borne parasites. And if you were lucky enough to live by the water, congratulations, you also lived by the mosquitoes. You see, the coast in those days wasn't a destination. It was a liminal zone, a sort of muddy border between civilization and chaos. People didn't move there for leisure. They were simply stuck there. Too poor to live inland, too superstitious to sail away. I spent my own share of years along the coast, granted, a few centuries after our medieval friends. But some things never change. Salt still corrodes, storms still gossip, and seagulls still act like they own the place. So, as you close your eyes tonight, imagine you're one of those poor souls, living by the medieval sea. A thatched hut perched on damp ground. The ocean your neighbor, your employer, and your greatest enemy. Let's take a walk through that life together, step by step, wave by wave. And if you nod off somewhere between the rotting nets and the smell of cod liver oil, well, that's the point, sailor. I'll keep watch. You rest easy. Now, first things first, the smell. It's dawn in a medieval fishing village. The tide's pulled back, leaving behind a stretch of black, glistening mud that looks like the ocean's hangover. The air is thick with brine and rotting kelp. Every breeze brings a new scent. Fish guts, damp wood, and the general perfume of people who bathe biannually. You're up early, of course, because the sea doesn't care about sleep schedules. The fishermen are already down at the shore, pulling boats that look one good wave away from splinters. Their hands are raw, their beards stiff with salt. There's no coffee yet, just a crust of barley bread, and maybe a prayer that today's catch will be less disappointing than yesterday's. Salt, back then, was both a blessing and a curse. It preserved food and destroyed everything else. Nets stiffened, tools rusted, and every surface you owned seemed to sweat. You couldn't escape it. Even your skin felt salted, rough and dry, like parchment left too long in the sun. And the wind, oh, the wind. It howled through every crack in your hut, rattling shutters, carrying gossip from the next village over. It brought sand into your soup, soot into your eyes, and despair into your bones. Now, you might imagine living by the sea meant endless sunshine and freedom. But this isn't some Renaissance painting. This is grey skies, biting cold, and seagulls that steal your breakfast with alarming dexterity. And then there's the rot. Everything rotted. Nets, ropes, boots, houses, even people eventually, though they tended to get a head start thanks to the diet. Fish was everywhere. It was dinner, breakfast, and probably part of your furniture if you looked closely enough. The oil from it soaked into your clothes, your hair, your soul. You didn't own the smell of fish. It owned you. I remember docking once in a small Scottish port, centuries later, of course, where the locals had been drying herring on racks for weeks. You could smell the place 3 miles offshore. I swear even the gulls were holding their breath. Still, the sea was everything. It provided life, even as it tried to take it back every other Tuesday. To live by it meant to accept the rules of salt and wind and rot, to surrender a bit of yourself to the tides. And yet, there was beauty in it too, in the shimmer of the horizon on a rare, clear day, in the rhythm of the waves slapping against the docks, in the feeling that you lived right on the skin of the world. You'd hear the bell of a buoy out there, a lonely clang in the mist, and know, deep down, that somewhere beyond that fog were other lives, other shores, and maybe, if you were lucky, a merchant ship with news of the wider world. Though, to be fair, the news in medieval times mostly consisted of plagues, taxes, and wars you couldn't afford to care about. Still, it was something. The sea was isolation and connection all at once, a cruel paradox that medieval coastal folk understood better than anyone. And when night fell, when the wind dropped and the waves settled into a steady hush, you could almost believe the sea was a friend. Almost, but don't get too sentimental, sailor, because the tide's coming back in, and with it comes the fish guts, the rats, and the reminder that tomorrow you'll do it all again. Living by the sea wasn't a dream. It was a negotiation, with weather, with hunger, and with fate itself. And sometimes, when the storms rolled in, I think even the bravest souls wondered if the land had the better idea. You can picture it, can't you? That small village clinging to the edge of the world, roofs sagging with salt, dogs howling at the wind, and some poor fisherman cursing the day he ever saw a shoreline. And yet, if you listen closely, beneath the creaking timbers and the sigh of the tide, there's something peaceful in all of it. Because that's what the sea teaches, sailor. Even misery has rhythm. You'd think a fishing village would smell like, well, fish. And you'd be right. But that's only half the tragedy. The medieval coast smelled like people who lived with fish. Fish in barrels, fish in baskets, fish in dreams. The kind of odor that seeps into your walls, your bread, your children's future prospects. Down by the docks, the fishmongers ruled the morning. They were the heart of any seaside town, loud, brisk, perpetually damp. Most were women, strong-armed and sharper-tongued than the gulls circling above. They'd be up before dawn, arranging piles of herring, cod, and eels onto rough wooden stalls. The market itself was a symphony of chaos, shouting, slapping fish onto scales, the wet thud of a cleaver meeting something once alive. And yet, there was beauty in their rhythm. You could stand there, half awake, watch the smoke from cook fires mingle with sea mist, and feel time slow down to the pace of the tide. The fishwives were tough, the unofficial enforcers of the waterfront. If you tried to haggle too hard, you might find yourself publicly humiliated and sent home with the worst of the catch. They carried their baskets on their heads, their pride in their voices, and enough gossip to power an entire village through a long winter. I once knew a woman like that, long after the medieval days, mind you. Sold oysters from a cart in Portsmouth. Could fillet a mackerel faster than I could blink. She told me once that men at sea think they're brave, but women on land keep the world turning. She wasn't wrong. Back in the medieval coastlines, there wasn't much of a separation between sea life and land life anyway. Fishermen, net menders, shipwrights, and tavern keepers, all of them lived in a cycle of salt and rumour. Children ran barefoot through puddles of brine, chasing stray crabs as if they were toys. Dogs scavenged through piles of shells and bones, and the richer folks, the merchants and guild masters, built their houses just far enough from the water that they could see the sea without smelling it. Still, the coast was where things happened. Ships came in, goods came out. Even kings depended on the tide for trade and taxes. But for the common folk, life by the sea was rarely about glory. It was about survival, one tide at a time. When storms tore apart a fleet, widows lined the shore in silence. No funerals, no graves, just the sound of waves swallowing the names of men. The village adapted the only way it knew how, by joking about it. Dark humor was the currency of the coast. Lose a husband. At least he's not complaining about supper anymore. Lose a boat? Well, the sea's collecting rent again. People laughed because crying didn't change the tide. And yet, there was camaraderie. The fishmongers, the sailors, the menders. They were bound by that invisible salt thread, the kind you can taste on your lips when you've been too long near the shore. At night, when the market closed and the gulls quieted, the taverns came alive. Rough wooden rooms, candle smoke thick as fog, laughter spilling into the streets. Sailors traded stories, mostly lies, with just enough truth to keep things interesting. Someone always played a fiddle missing its A string. Someone else always tried to dance and regretted it. Ale was the great equalizer. Didn't matter if you were a fisherman or a merchant. Once the mug was in your hand, you were part of the crew. And if you listened closely, past the laughter, past the creak of barrels and the slosh of drink, you'd hear the ocean just outside, constant, patient, reminding everyone that tomorrow's tide could take it all away. I remember a night like that once, years ago. I'd just made port in a Cornish town after a week of foul weather. Walked into a tavern so small it could barely contain its own smoke. A group of fishwives were playing cards with two sailors and a priest. The priest was losing terribly, but he seemed to enjoy it. They sang old songs that didn't belong to anyone, half hymns, half curses, all about the sea. The kind of songs that sound like they've been echoing since the first boat was built. When I left that night, the moon was rising over the water. The tide was out, and the sand glistened like spilled wine. I remember thinking, somehow, misery always looks beautiful under moonlight. Now, sailor, if you've ever cursed the weather, spare a thought for those who lived when weather was practically a religion. A medieval coastal storm was not a gentle inconvenience. It was the wrath of creation itself. Waves big enough to eat a church, wind sharp enough to peel the bark from trees. They had no radar, no warnings, no clever little icons on their phones showing cheerful clouds with lightning bolts. Just dark skies, aching bones, and that uneasy hush before the world decided to turn upside down. People read the wind like scripture. A red sunrise meant blood on the waves. A halo around the moon meant you'd better tie down your roof and pray to whatever god was listening. And oh, there were gods aplenty. Some villages prayed to St. Nicholas, not the jolly gift-giver, mind you, but the original one, patron of sailors, fishermen, and anyone dumb enough to go near the water. Others kept old pagan charms hidden in their homes, seashells over doorways, knots tied 3 times against drowning. Sailors refused to cut their hair before a voyage. Women weren't allowed on ships, except when they were, because superstition is like that, flexible when convenient, and heaven forbid you whistled aboard a vessel. That was said to call the wind, which, depending on who you asked, was either very good or very bad. So the rule was simple: no whistling unless you were an optimist or an idiot. Then there were the mermaids. Most coastal folk genuinely believed in them. Half woman, half fish, full nightmare. They sang, they lured, they doomed ships with a smile. Some said they were fallen angels, others said they were just lonely. Personally, I think they were metaphors for bad decisions. When a storm hit, people blamed them, or the sea herself, or that one guy who definitely forgot to sacrifice a goat last harvest. But sometimes, storms were just storms, and they were brutal. The sea walls were crude, the houses low. Floodwaters could sweep through a town in hours, turning cobbled streets into rivers. Whole villages washed away overnight, roofs floating off like driftwood, livestock bobbing along in grim procession. If you lived through it, you rebuilt. If you didn't, well, the sea was always hungry. I recall one particularly bad storm, not in those days, but in my own youth, off the coast of Brittany. The sky went black at noon. We tied the sails, prayed, swore, and sang, sometimes all at once. The ocean roared like it was laughing at us. By dawn, we'd lost 2 men and half the cargo, but the sunrise came soft and pink, as if nothing had happened. That's the cruelty of it, sailor. The sea never apologizes. Back in medieval times, after a storm, people combed the beaches for what the waves spat back. Wreckage, barrels, sometimes bodies. They called it God's bounty, a grim phrase, but that's how you justified surviving. There was an odd kind of hope in it, though. The sea took and gave. Some mornings it gave enough to live another day, and through all of this, the floods, the storms, the endless guessing at the moods of the water, people still stayed. They rebuilt on the same patch of wet earth, again and again, generation after generation. Why? Maybe because leaving would mean surrender, or maybe because the sea, for all her cruelty, had a way of making people believe she loved them back. There's a certain madness in loving something that can kill you, and yet we do it all the time. The sea just happens to be better at it. So tonight, as the wind hums softly in your room, remember those who heard it roar. Those who stood on the shore, lanterns in hand, staring into the dark, waiting for sails that never came home. And maybe, just maybe, they're still out there, drifting somewhere between storm and story. You're probably feeling the rhythm now, sailor. The waves are steady, the lamps burning low. Don't fight the pull, that's just the tide of sleep coming in. But if you're still awake, I'll keep talking, because the sea has more tales to tell. By daylight, the medieval coast was a marketplace. By night, it was a confession booth with ale. Ships came in heavy with salt, wool, wine, tin, and gossip. Merchants shouted numbers that changed with the wind. Scribes tallied cargo with quills that never seemed to have enough ink. And somewhere behind it all, a barefoot boy carried buckets of fish heads to feed the town pigs. Trade meant everything, and nothing ever went smoothly. If the tide was wrong, you waited. If the wind was wrong, you prayed. If both were wrong, you opened a tab at the tavern and complained about foreign tariffs. Ports were the social networks of their day. You didn't scroll. You wandered the wharf, hoping to overhear something profitable. News of kings, crusades, or rumors that someone had seen a whale big enough to rent out as housing. And then there were the taverns themselves. Every port had at least three, one for sailors, one for merchants, and one that pretended to be respectable until the bishop went home. Inside, it was candlelight and chaos, tables sticky with ale, dice rattling like bones, someone always claiming to have invented a new knot that would change maritime history. I remember such a tavern in Bruges, centuries later, but close enough in spirit. The owner trained his cat to sit on the counter and glare at anyone who spoke ill of the beer. Worked better than a bouncer. In medieval ports, these places were more than dens of drink. They were infrastructure. Deals were made there, ships hired, debts forgiven, or at least postponed until dawn. And the people who kept them running were the real navigators, innkeepers, brewers, the women who poured ale from casks twice their size. They kept morale afloat while the rest of the town dealt with mud and mortality. Toil never stopped. When ships weren't sailing, hands still worked, mending nets, drying fish, scraping barnacles, repairing ropes that always seemed one storm from disaster. Labor wasn't just physical, it was seasonal, tidal. Spring brought herring, autumn brought storms, winter brought despair and knitting. Children learned early, tie knots, gut fish, don't drown. If they were lucky, they'd grow up to own the boat that killed them. Yet for all the hardship, there was dignity in that repetition. A rhythm, the kind of routine that lets the mind wander while the hands work. And when night fell and the harbour lamps flickered on, the town glowed faintly gold against the dark sea. Ships rocked at their moorings like tired beasts. Someone somewhere sang off key, and you could almost believe the whole coast was exhaling. The nights were the truest thing about coastal life. That was when the noise faded and the sea started whispering again. Picture it, a line of huts, roofs thatched with straw so soaked it might as well be kelp. A lantern swinging outside a doorway, the faint crackle of peat smoke. You're lying on a straw mattress, listening to waves slap the shore like a heartbeat that forgot its rhythm. The air tastes of salt and smoke. Someone's dog barks once, then decides it isn't worth the effort. Most of the village is asleep, though a few are still awake. The night watchman pacing with a lantern, a midwife waiting on a cry, a sailor staring out at the horizon that won't stop moving. The sea at night was different. During the day it demanded, haul this, mend that, fetch, carry, curse. At night it simply watched, black glass stretching forever, catching starlight in ripples. Some said you could hear voices in it, lost sailors calling home, or the gods chatting over last drinks. Most said it was the wind in the rigging. Personally, I think it was both. I used to lie awake on my first ship, listening to the water slide along the hull. The sound reminded me of breathing, like the ocean itself was half asleep, dreaming of continents. In those medieval nights, people filled silence with stories. They told of ghosts walking the beach, searching for their bones, of lights under the waves, lanterns from drowned towns, or fish with souls, and of course of sea witches who could summon tempests with a whisper. Fear, you see, was a kind of lullaby. Tales kept you alert just long enough to finish the night watch, and tired enough to welcome morning. And sometimes, when dawn crept pale over the water, the fear didn't seem so foolish. You'd see shapes in the mist, maybe driftwood, maybe something else, and decide not to look too closely. Even the bravest kept charms, a bit of coral, a coin with a hole, a prayer carved into driftwood. Superstition was insurance you could afford, so they endured, one tide at a time, because the sea never promised kindness, only continuity. That's what I've always admired about those coastal souls. They didn't need adventure or glory. They needed weather that wasn't trying to kill them, and bread that didn't taste of brine. Simple dreams, beautiful, miserable, human. And there we are, sailor. We've reached the calm water again. If you're still awake, I commend your endurance. Most drift off somewhere around the second mention of barnacles. We've seen what it meant to live by the sea when romance was a luxury and waterproofing was a myth. The salt, the storms, the toil, the endless rebuilding. It wasn't paradise, but it was life, stubborn and rhythmic. And maybe that's why those villages endured for centuries. The sea took much, but it also gave them a sense of place no inland soul could understand. When you live with the tides, you learn humility and humor. You stop expecting fairness and start appreciating the rare calm days. So as the last waves of this story roll in, breathe with them. In and out. The storm has passed. The nets are mended. The lamps are dim. Somewhere in that old village, a fisherman's child dreams of dry land. Somewhere else, a woman folds a net and hums a tune her mother taught her. And the sea, as always, listens without answering. You too can rest now. Let the rhythm of the water slow your thoughts. Let the gulls in your mind finally roost. You've weathered the night's voyage. Sleep well, sailor. I'll keep watch till morning.